Richard Clarke's book, The Scorpion's Gate. At the top of this book, it says that sometimes you can tell more truth through fiction. Mr. Clarke, what is that truth you're trying to tell?
Well, there are several. One of them has to do with the effect on our foreign policy and on our national security policy that is caused by our dependence on foreign oil, and the fact that that's only going to get worse as China and other countries increase their demand for foreign oil as well.
Would you be surprised if Saudi Arabia was taken over by a fundamentalist group in the next 10 years?
No, and I don't think any experts on Saudi Arabia would be. That doesn't mean it's going to happen, although in the novel Scorpion's Gate it does happen. Scorpion's Gate's not meant to be predictive. It's a future 5 years from now in which some existing trends have been extrapolated, including instability in Saudi Arabia. But it's meant to let the reader think about the problems that we may face in the next 5 years before they happen.
Who is Brian Douglas?
Now, Brian Douglas in the novel is a British spy. And he's British because, frankly, CIA doesn't do a very good job of spying, and yet the British do. With fewer people and a lot less money, they produce a lot better results, particularly in the Middle East. So in Scorpion's Gate, Brian Douglas is a British spy who has to go behind the lines to reactivate a spy network.
Is it fair to say that the Secretary of Defense and the President don't come off too well in your book?
Well, the President never appears in the book. And it's also not clear who the President is because it's 2010 or 2011.
But he's referred to.
He's referred to a couple of times, but he doesn't appear, or she, whoever it is. It's the President after the incumbent.
But again, to the question, would you say that they don't? The Secretary of Defense then does not come off too well?
I think that's certainly true of the Secretary of Defense. He is a character in the book who appears from time to time. He's motivated by things that some people will agree with and identify with. He's motivated by the desire to have the United States have a secure source of Middle Eastern oil. And he's willing to do almost anything. The ends justify the means. He's willing to do almost anything to keep the oil flowing to the United States.
Is that character based on anyone in particular?
No, none of the characters in the book are meant to be real people. They may share characteristics with a series of real-world people. In that extent, they're composites. But what it's meant to be is a way of projecting the reader into these closed-door meetings, into these command posts, places where they've never been, meetings where they've never been, so they can see what it's like in the Pentagon, in the Middle East, when these crises happen.
Richard Clarke has written a novel, The Scorpion's Gate. Time for a few phone calls. Los Angeles, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Clarke, how are you doing today?
Very good, sir. How are you?
Good. Now, I've noticed that you've been quite critical of President Bush, correct?
I've been quite critical of his policies on terrorism and homeland security and Iraq.
Okay, I understand that. But here's one thing I have with you and people like you, even though I do respect your intellect and I respect your service to the country. You're in Miami right now, correct?
Pardon me?
You're in that book fair you're at is in Miami, correct?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Did you know there's a NASCAR race not far from you going on very shortly from right now?
Okay, and what's the point of that?
Oh, what the point is, I don't think you understand Middle America, partner. Because I'll tell you, those people there, that's Middle America. They love George W. Bush. His policies ain't perfect, but I don't care how many books you write, how critical you are, Middle America likes him.
Well, that's fine. Middle America reelected him. All I'm saying is that Middle America and the rest of America needs to know the facts so they can make informed judgments. Because there are very decisions being made that affect the lives of millions of people. And you may agree with those decisions, but you need to know the basis on which they were made.
Indianapolis, good afternoon. You're on Book TV with Richard Clarke.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Mr. Clarke. would
Hi,
just
how
like
are
to
you?
tie in, if I could, to the last guest that C-SPAN had on, Mr. Goldberg. I just finished reading his book, and I've read your book, Against All Enemies. I haven't read your new book, but I enjoyed your first book very much. And could you talk briefly about the demonization? I heard you on National Public Radio talking a bit about what you went through after you came out with the book, and then, you know, going before the 9/11 commission. And in Mr. Goldberg's book, he's highly critical of many people that I admire and think are great Americans, in particular Jimmy Carter, who I think has just been a national treasure, as I do think you are, sir. And I would just like to have you maybe comment on what it's like with somebody who puts out a book of the 100 people who are screwing up America. I don't know if you're on that list, but I'm surprised if you wouldn't be in Mr. Goldberg's eyes. So could you just maybe comment about what you went through after coming out with the book and going before the 9/11 Commission?
Well, what happens now, I think, in our public dialogue, our public discourse, is that if you criticize the Bush administration or you disagree with the Bush administration, that their propaganda machinery, both official White House propaganda machinery and their informal party machinery, criticizes you as a person rather than discussing the ideas. This happened to the Secretary of the Treasury, Paul O'Neill. It happened to Ambassador Joe Wilson. And this week, unbelievably, it happened to Congressman Murtha, who is a Democrat, who has 2 Purple Hearts, the Bronze Star, who served in the Marine Corps for over 30 years. And when he had the temerity to disagree with the Iraq war policy, he was called a coward. And, you know, I think we need to get back to a more civil dialogue in this country, where you and I can disagree vehemently about the facts or about our analysis of the facts, but we don't need to go after each other and attack people's motives or attack people's background. And it's ludicrous, by the way, when you attack someone like Murtha and say he's a coward when he actually was in combat, unlike the people who are saying that he's a coward. I think it's ludicrous when you attack someone like former Senator Max Cleland of Georgia and say he's not patriotic when he lost 3 of his 4 limbs fighting for the United States.
Mr. Clarke, did you work with John Murtha and Duncan Hunter in your previous position in the White House?
I had to work with them, yes, slightly, because they were very important to appropriating money for some of our counterterrorism programs.
What is your opinion of the gentlemen and ladies that you worked with in Congress?
Well, I think by and large, they're hardworking. There are some who perhaps need to work a little harder, but if you look at the 535 members of Congress, you'll find an awful lot of people up there who are really expert in their issues and spend very, very long hours working on their issues.
Kendall, Florida, you're on the air with Richard Clarke. Go ahead.
Hello, Mr. Clarke. I hope
Yes,
you're
hello.
enjoying Miami.
Well, I'm not here long enough to do that.
My question's going to add to civil discourse, which I really wish would develop in this country. But since 9/11, I've gone back and tried to read more books about the Middle East. I've tried to understand more about Al-Qaeda. I've read or heard how Bill Clinton tried to deal with the terrorism that he had to deal with. I do think it's not credible to suggest he could have declared war. But when I make the comparison between Clinton's actions to bring out more evidence and Bush's apparent actions to suppress evidence, it seems to me possible to come to the conclusion that Bush wanted the attack to happen as an excuse for war. And I'm wondering if, from your experience, you could give me some specific facts, not the general belief George Bush is a noble, honorable man and he wouldn't deliberately let an attack occur. I don't think he or anyone else in his administration expected planes being flown into the Twin Towers, although other people knew that was a possibility. But is there anything that would weigh the side that he wouldn't have let that happen?
Well, I think there is this broad conspiracy theory out there that the Bush administration let the attacks happen. The fact is they didn't know the attacks were going to take place, not in the United States. CIA had told the president that attacks were probably coming, but CIA said those attacks will probably occur overseas. And we did all we could do overseas to heighten security at U.S. embassies and military bases. Domestically, we didn't know an attack was coming domestically, but even if we did, there are so many facilities to protect that there wasn't a great deal we could do without more information. I'm pretty confident that if we had that information, the president would have acted. We didn't have that information. My complaint is that the president, being told that something was about to happen, did nothing to try to shake the trees to find out what was about to happen.
Mr. Clarke, did this book have to be cleared by the CIA or anyone?
Any book I write for the rest of my life has to be cleared by the government for security purposes to make sure I'm not revealing anything that is still classified.
Did you have to take anything out of the original draft?
Out of the Scorpion's Gate, no. Out of Against All Enemies, I'm afraid I did.
Last call, Lake Bridgeport, Texas, you're on.
Howdy. Okay. Let's see. I'm just.
Caller, we're going to have to let you go. We are out of time. I apologize for that. So thanks for trying anyway. So Richard Clarke is the author of The Scorpion's Gate. In fact, just a minute, he'll be talking to that audience behind him in Chapman Auditorium here on the campus of Miami-Dade College in downtown Miami. Mr. Clarke, thank you.
Thank you very much.
And we will be going to that event in just a minute or so. As soon as Mr. Clarke gets up on stage, we'll give him a chance to unbuckle, and then we'll listen to him talk to the audience and take questions from the audience there. We've got about, an hour and a half or so, an hour 45 left in our live programming today here at the Miami Book Fair International. After Mr. Clarke, we will speak with Umberto Fontova. He has a new book out, Fidel, Hollywood's Favorite Tyrant. We'll be talking about Fidel Castro and U.S.-Cuban policy. And then at 3 p.m. Eastern Time this afternoon, there is a live event, live panel discussion on science and inventors. Alan Lightman, Rebecca Goldstein, and David Levitt will be on that panel, and that runs from about 3 p.m. Eastern Time to 4:15 Eastern Time, and we'll bring that to you live. While Mr. Clarke is getting ready to speak, we want to show you around the fair here in downtown Miami.
Just pass it.
Bueno, vamos a buscarlo. Yo que él.
Dicen que vaya, oye, yeah. Right.
Miami, my nigga! That's the conference hall that works for you?
Who's who? Do we have another outside camera? If we're taking directions from
Gene's here, I gave him my bag.
They were just in there comparing middle names. Mr. Bard is the Deputy World Editor of the Miami Herald. Please welcome him.
Good afternoon. Richard Clarke entered the national consciousness in 2004 after publication of his nonfiction book, Against All Enemies. It soon climbed to the top of the New York Times bestseller list. In that book, he argued that the Bush administration had failed to treat the al-Qaeda threat as a priority before the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks, and that the invasion of Saddam Hussein's Iraq undermined the war on terrorism. The ideas in that book have become part of the debate over U.S. strategy in the battle against terrorism and over the decision to invade Iraq. That national discussion has only intensified, as we have seen this past week in the halls of Congress. Publication of Against All Enemies came after a career in federal service that spanned some 30 years. Mr. Clarke began his federal service in 1973 in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He has worked for every president since Ronald Reagan. In the Reagan administration, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence. Under the first President Bush, he was Assistant Secretary of State for Political and Military Affairs and a member of the National Security Council. That was followed by 8 years as a special assistant to President Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. From 2001 until 2003, he was the special advisor to the President for cyberspace security. And on September 11th, after terrorists struck the United States, he found himself acting as crisis manager in the White House, in the Situation Room. He currently serves as chairman of Good Harbor Consulting. Now Mr. Clarke has written a work of fiction, and he says fiction can often tell the truth better than nonfiction. I'm pleased to welcome Richard Clarke to Miami and to the Miami Book Fair.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here in Miami today. I appreciate that. Please. Thank you. Thank you for that warm Miami welcome. And Richard, thank you for that introduction. It's a pleasure to come here and talk about my first work of fiction, or if you believe the White House, my second work of fiction. As I was traveling around the country last year talking about Against All Enemies, Inside America's War on Terror, an awful lot of readers urged me to continue writing. And they asked me to continue writing because, A, they were curious about what it's like to be in those meetings in the White House and in the Middle East, what it's like to go to those places like the bunkers and the intelligence centers. But more importantly, the second reason, they wanted me to continue to talk about the Middle East and our relationship with it. And I thought, you know, I'd be glad to continue that dialogue with the readers, but I'd like it to be a different set of readers, a more inclusive set of readers. Now, many of you might go to a bookstore and pick up a non-fiction book on foreign policy and national security, but most folks won't. And when I thought about it, if I didn't have to teach national security, I probably wouldn't read those books either. What is it that I normally read, especially on a long flight across the Atlantic, which I'm taking tonight, by the way. I'm going to Berlin tonight. And the answer is, I normally pick up a thriller. And when I thought about it, I've learned a lot by reading thrillers. Now, I recognize that some of the things you read in thrillers aren't true. Depends on the author. But a lot of it is, and it at least can raise issues. And it can raise issues in a way that sometimes grabs the reader much more personally than a nonfiction book. So I thought back to something we did a lot in the White House called tabletop exercises, or visualization exercises. Here's what we would do. We would get the cabinet members together, or the deputy cabinet members, and put them around a U-shaped table with a screen up front, and usually me in the middle with a microphone pretending to be Geraldo Rivera. And we would say to the cabinet members, all right, suspend disbelief a moment. It's a few years from now. Here are the changes that have occurred in the 2 or 3 years now that we're in the future. But basically everything's the same, aside from these few changes. Now we're going to give you a crisis, and you're going to act like the cabinet, like the National Security Council would. You're going to play yourself and react to the crisis. So one crisis, for example, we said, the FBI has just learned that there is a nuclear bomb on board a yacht tied up at Main Avenue in Washington. Now, Main Avenue was about a mile from where we were meeting in the White House. And they sort of looked at that and thought about it. And then it was my job to take the microphone and put it in the face of Janet Reno and say, all right, Attorney General, what are you going to do about it? And the meeting would flow from there. And they had to make decisions as though it was the real world. And the controllers of the game would react to their decisions to keep presenting them with a series of plot twists and turns, if you will, so that they were simulating the experience of a real crisis. It grabbed them. Every single one of them got into the game and started worrying about how they were going to stop that nuclear bomb from going off. And we presented them with all of the tough questions that they would have to face in the real world. Now, the reason we did that was so that, God forbid, they ever had to face that reality of a terrorist with a nuclear weapon in the nation's capital, they would have already done it. It would be that much easier for them because they would already have thought through the issues under a little bit less pressure than if it were actually happening. Because we did those games, when September 11th happened, and I was thrown into the role of crisis manager, I didn't have to think too hard about the steps that we had to execute, because we had exercised and exercised and practiced and practiced. So there was a real-world value to these visualization exercises. But the other value was that the cabinet members would usually go back to their departments after the exercise, assemble their key staff, and say, I don't ever want to have to face that kind of event in the real world. What can we do now to prevent that sort of thing from happening? And because of that, the Clinton administration and the Bush administration initiated a series of programs that came as a result of playing these exercises, and the cabinet members saying, boy, we have to make sure that never happens. So I thought, wouldn't it be good if I could write a thriller that used that same technique, that said, it's the real world, but it's 5 years from now. And here are the things that have changed. Not much. And many of the things that are troublesome now have gotten more troublesome. We've extrapolated real-world events. And the purpose is twofold. One, to bring the reader into those meetings behind closed doors, into those crisis rooms, into the back alleys of the Middle East. But two, to leave the reader asking, how can we do things now so that we don't have to face that kind of world 5 years from now? So let me tell you a few of the trends that are extrapolated in Scorpion's Gate. The first is our dependence on foreign oil, Middle Eastern oil, and how our dependence on Middle Eastern oil transforms and distorts our foreign policy and our national security policy. Right now, we're the world's largest importer of oil. Number two, however, is China. And China is increasing its rate of imports more rapidly than we are. As the world's oil reserves draw down, the United States and China, as the two largest oil importers in the world, will be competing for the same oil supplies. Now, hopefully that competition will be peaceful. But what if it's not? Already in the real world of 2005, the Deputy Secretary of State, Robert Zoellick, has said recently that we're troubled by the fact that China seems to be trying to get exclusive oil deals with countries in the Middle East. In Scorpion's Gate, they are trying to get a very exclusive oil deal with the largest producer of oil in the Middle East. And that would be Saudi Arabia. The novel opens in 2010, 18 months after the royal house of Saud has been overthrown. Now, is that possible? That the government of Saudi Arabia could be overthrown? It's possible. Think back to 1979, when our best friend in the Middle East, and the guy who was selling us all the oil, was the Shah of Iran, the head of the House of Pahlavi, the royal house in Persia. And we would ask the Shah and his government, how stable is the government? How popular is the Shah? We'd like to go around Iran and find out, using the CIA, using the State Department. And the Shah's government always said, no, you can't do that. But we'll tell you the answers. Everybody loves the Shah. The Shah's government is very stable. And then we woke up one day in 1979 and the Shah was out and the Ayatollahs were in. and we weren't getting any oil from Iran anymore. Well, there's the potential for that in Saudi Arabia. The Saudi royal family, the 2,200 princes, big family, the Saudi royal family doesn't want us wandering around, either the CIA or the State Department, wandering around Saudi Arabia trying to find out how stable they are or how popular they are. They tell us to rely on them, and they'll tell us. And they tell us everybody loves the king, and everybody loves the royal family. And yet every month or so, we see some incident where people are shooting at each other in Jeddah or Riyadh for 18 or 20 hours, where some major terrorist attack has occurred. So we know that there is some opposition. We know that 15 of the 19 hijackers on September 11th came from Saudi Arabia. And the U.S. Army is now reporting that the majority of the foreign fighters who are showing up in Iraq, and certainly the majority of the suicide bombers in Iraq, are Saudi. And we know that the CIA has reported that many people are going to Iraq, learning how to become terrorists in Iraq, training by attacking our soldiers, and then many of them are going home and creating terrorist cells and spreading their expertise at making bombs and attacking soldiers. Therefore, many of them must be going home to Saudi Arabia. I don't think it's therefore that hard to extrapolate that 5 years from now, we could be facing a situation where the House of Saud has fallen. So as Scorpion's Gate opens, the House of Saud has fallen, and as so often in revolutions, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, people united to get rid of the government in power. And then when they got rid of the government in power, they discovered they all didn't agree with each other. And so the people who threw out the House of Saud are struggling to see who will dominate the new Saudi Arabia. Will it become an Al-Qaeda-like government, or could it be more moderate, more democratic, more representative of the people? The other trend that I'm extrapolating in Scorpion's Gate is what's going on with Iran. You know, I used to talk to audiences before September 11th and talk about the danger of Al-Qaeda, and people would, almost in every audience, as I said Al-Qaeda for the first time, you could see people in the audience turning to each other and saying, "Who? What's that?" People hadn't heard about Al-Qaeda. Well, now they haven't heard about Al-Quds, Q-O-D-S, Al-Quds, the Quds force. Quds in Farsi and in Arabic means Jerusalem. Quds force is a real, secret intelligence paramilitary organization run by Iran. It blew up the Jewish centers in Buenos Aires, in the real world. It blew up the U.S. Air Force Base at Khobar, Saudi Arabia. And it's now sending thousands of its agents into Iraq, so that when we leave, which ultimately we will, the Iranians will have a great deal of influence in the new state of Iraq. I haven't seen very much written in the unclassified open literature about the Quds force. And so I tell you in Scorpion's Gate as much as I can about Quds force and what I think it has done and the way I think it acts and operates. That too is a force that we can extrapolate forward about 5 years. The final trend that we see today that plays out in Scorpion's Gate is the problem that military officers have, and professional diplomats, professional intelligence officers have, career people, not partisan, not political appointees, career people, experts, with 20 or more years of service, the problem that they have when they realize that their government is making mistakes, when they realize that some people in their government are covering things up from the people and from the Congress. What do they do when they think their government is lying? And that's something that a lot of people in the U.S. government today are struggling with. So an awful lot of our military are struggling over whether or not they can come forward and say what they believe without risking their pensions, their careers, and their families. You'll see in Scorpion's Gate some of the characters dealing with that conundrum, that moral and ethical and professional conundrum. Scorpion's Gate has about 5 major characters. They don't know each other as the book begins. They each uncover a little piece of the jigsaw puzzle of what is about to happen. If they can all meet, and if they all then are willing to exchange the information that they have, they can put together the jigsaw puzzle. And they can see what's about to happen. And what's about to happen could change the entire nature of the Middle East. If they can get together and if they can find that out, is there anything that these 5 people can do to stop it from happening? Because the clock's ticking and a major event is about to go down. That's the plot. I'll leave it to you to figure out if they get together, and I will leave it to you to figure out if they can stop it. I hope, for those of you who read Scorpion's Gate, that it will tell you a little bit about what it's like in these occupations, and tell you a little bit of the issues that we face now and the background, the historical background to how we got here, but also preview for you what I think are going to be issues that we will face in the next 5 years. So thank you very much for coming. And we'll be glad for the next few minutes until I get hooked off the stage here to answer a few questions. Yes, sir.
One word going on after your delivery, and that was called trust. It seems as though it would require trust. Yet, how is a government supposed to, shall we say, get responses when the public answers may be aiding what we describe as the enemy or see as the enemy?
Yeah, it's a tough question. The government has frequently in the past hidden behind a statement that we can't tell you everything because it would help the enemy. That's almost never true. The enemy knows all the enemy needs to know to do what they're doing. I mean, it reminds me of the charge that if the American government has a public discussion about when we should start the withdrawal from Iraq, then the terrorists will be emboldened. I never understood that logic either. I mean, the terrorists are emboldened. It's not as though the terrorists are holding back, something that they could do, and then they're going to say, oh my God, the Congress is discussing when to leave Iraq, let's attack something. I don't think that the kinds of things that the public needs to know to participate in a public discussion of our national security in any way helps the enemy. The level of detail that would help the enemy is generally not necessary for this kind of discussion.
Then why no trust?
Well, trust is a two-way street. I think the American people tended to trust their government in recent years. I think in the last 2 years, as more people have realized that their government distorted the truth, that trust has eroded, and it's going to take a long time for us to get it back. Yes, sir.
I enjoy reading your first book, Against All Enemies. I'm looking forward now to reading your new novel. I wanted to ask you what it was like being the target of the Republican smear machine when you first revealed that Bush had ignored all your warnings about 9/11 and Al-Qaeda. And do you think that people are beginning to see through their tactics now, that everyone who comes up and criticizes them is either accused of being unpatriotic, anyone who criticizes their policies is accused of being un-American? Do you think people are starting to see through these tactics and start to question the source itself?
Yeah, you know, Senator Hagel, who's a Republican, Chuck Hagel, said the other day that it's not unpatriotic to question our policies. It's unpatriotic not to. Whether you agree with our policies in Iraq or on the war on terrorism or not, I think you have to believe, if you're an American, that policy should be subject to regular open discussion in the press and in forums and in the Congress. That's the way we've done it for 200 years, and it's kind of worked. We should not abandon that now. And when the president says, well, you can't question my policies because that'll hurt our troops, I mean, that's just not true. I think people see through the tactic of attacking the critics when, for example, you look at the pattern. You know, this week we had a man who served in the Marine Corps for 30 years, over 30 years, had a Bronze Star for combat, two Purple Hearts for having been wounded in combat. And he stood up and said, I don't think our policy in Iraq is working. And people called him a coward. People who've never put on the uniform, people who've never served in the military, never risked their lives in any way, shape, or form. You know, that's just wrong. And it was wrong when Max Cleland, the senator from Georgia, was running for re-election. And the smear machine said he was unpatriotic. Now, I don't know if you all know about Max, but he lost 3 of his 4 limbs fighting for this country. And the audacity of anyone to say that Max Cleland was unpatriotic is outrageous. So I think it's beginning to backfire. You know, I think people are beginning to see through the attacker. Don't talk about the issues. Don't talk about the substance, but attack the critic. I don't think that's working anymore. And I hope, as the Republican White House smear machine sees that it's not working, they'll stop it. In my case, they stopped it after about a week or 10 days when they realized that they were selling my book. And I could only wish that they had kept it up for another week or 2. But. Yes, sir.
Hi. I would like to personally thank you for having the courage to come forward when you did to speak the truth. And I feel that there were really too few voices expressing that point of view. I'd like to ask you, there's a lot of debate right now as to whether or not the President and the Congress had the same intelligence to go by and drew different conclusions based on that same intelligence. And I'd like to ask you, and there's also a debate going on right now as to whether or not if we were to pull out, which I think in the end we are going to end up pulling out, and it's going to be a destabilized Iraq that we end up leaving. Do you share that view? And if and what do you think the end result in Iraq will be?
Well, first of all, the people in the White House get very detailed intelligence. They get what we call raw intelligence. So if a spy somewhere says something, they get that specific report. If we hear something being broadcast, they get the transcript. They get the satellite picture. What the Congress gets is analysis. Imagine all of this raw intelligence coming down into a funnel and dropping on the desk of an analyst. And the analyst has to figure out what's going on, what's true, what's false, because just because we collect something doesn't mean it's true. And then put that together and draw a conclusion. The Congress, by and large, gets the conclusion. They don't get the actual material. And so, for example, in this now famous or infamous case of intelligence that said that an African country was selling uranium to Iraq so that Iraq could build a nuclear weapon, Congress was told that in the National Intelligence Estimate, but they never actually got to see the document that said that. Now, most of you, if you saw the document, would realize it was a forgery. It was pretty bad forgery. That's the difference. Congress doesn't get to see the source information, if you will. You know, with regard to Iraq, if we withdraw, will there be chaos? Yeah, there's chaos now. And we're seeing upwards of 80 to 100 attacks a day against coalition forces. That's about double what it was when the Vice President said the insurgency was on its last legs. Yeah, I suspect whenever we withdraw, there will be chaos, and that's the point. Whenever we withdraw, whether we withdraw in 2007 or we withdraw in 2010, there will be some period of chaos, much as there is today. The question is, how long will that chaos last? What will the outcome be? And do we really change that by staying? In my view, there will be some chaos when we pull out, and then the Iraqis will stabilize their own country. You know, they'll get a modus vivendi going among the factions. And I don't see the point in delaying until 2010 or 2012, because if we hang on for that long, we will kill a lot more American soldiers, and we'll kill a lot more Iraqis. And I don't think the difference will be appreciable whether we withdraw in 2007 or 2012. So, having done that analysis, I think we ought to get out in 2007. Sir.
Thanks. I read the first book, which I enjoyed a lot. Two things that maybe you could speak to. Number one was the bin Laden flight. I'd like to hear some comment on that. And then the relationship between the Bushes and Prince Bandar, who I understand is no longer in D.C.
By the bin Laden flight, you mean the flight of the bin Laden family members after September 11th? You know, there's been one of the minor controversies coming out of the 9/11 investigation is the question of why did we allow Saudi royal family members and bin Laden family members to leave the United States after the attack. They requested, the Saudi embassy requested permission to evacuate some people who they thought would be at risk. You have to understand the bin Laden family is enormous. There are 20-something sons, huge family. Most of the family, almost all of it, is reputable. They're business people. Some of them have been in the United States doing business for years. And we know that because we kept an eye on them. As you can imagine, if your name was Bin Laden and you were living in the United States, even in the 1990s, we probably have a very good idea of what you were doing every day and who you were talking to and what you were saying. So when the Saudi embassy wanted to evacuate some royal family members and some bin Laden family members, a request came to me at the White House, and I said yes, provided that the FBI cleared every individual and said that they didn't want to talk to any of those individuals before they got on the plane. And the FBI looked at the list, and they knew a lot about all of the people on the list, and decided that they didn't need to talk to them. And so they left. Had I that to do over again, I'd probably do the same thing. I don't see any downside to the fact that they left. It turns out that now, 4 years later, the FBI still doesn't want to talk to them. So I don't think we've missed any opportunity there. As regard to the relationship between the Bush family and the Saudi prince who was their ambassador in Washington, very, very close. Very, very close, unusually close. And that turned out to be a good thing in the first Gulf War. But I think over time it turned out probably to give us only one side of what was going on in Saudi Arabia. Yes, sir.
A statement I want to make is something that I hope you can support or not support. And it supports some of the things you've said before. And that is first that the world's production of oil is going to peak at around 90 million barrels a day, predicted by many geologists. It's based on Hubbards's theory, as you know, and where they predicted the United States would peak in 1970. Indeed, we did. And that's one point. And by the way, last year we produced about 84 million barrels of oil, so 90 is real close to what the world is now producing. Number two, we get about 70% of our oil from the Middle East, from those 5 countries in the Middle East. And I hate to say it, but I really feel that it's one of the strong motivations for what's happening now in the Middle East. Our strong attention to the Middle East is this oil. Well,
You're right to point out that when oil peaks, which is to say when we reach the halfway point in the oil that's in the world, is a matter of some controversy. And the Saudis, among the many things they don't let us do, is to go in and independently verify how much oil they actually have in the ground. So we're basing our assumptions on their data about how much oil they've got left. And oil, oil is fungible, so that if any one source of oil gets cut off from the world supply, people buy it elsewhere on the spot market. The point I'm trying to make in the book is that we're not serious about alternative energy supplies. There's a lot of things that we could do today with existing technology, with ethanol. If you go to Brazil, they're driving around in cars that work perfectly fine on sugarcane created fuels. So we don't have to have nuclear fusion in order to solve our energy problem. There's a lot that we could do today that we're not doing, and I just don't think we're serious about it. And if we continue to rely on market forces to dictate the outcome, we'll be paying $7 a barrel at some point in the future. We subsidize so many things in this country. We subsidize a few rich people who grow peanuts and a few rich people who grow rice and sugar, absolutely. But we won't subsidize the cost of fuel by underwriting, let's say, an ethanol program. And as a result of that, there have been 2 oil wars. Our war in 1990-91 in Kuwait was an oil war, and the war that we're going through now in Iraq is an oil war, and we'll continue to have them until and unless we reduce our dependency on Middle Eastern oil. Yes, sir.
Following up on the question about intelligence, each branch of the military has their own intelligence agency, their war colleges, the history of that area before the Ottoman Empire. How did the administration so badly underestimate what would happen in Iraq after the initial invasion? I still can't understand why they didn't see this out. All that's been going on for centuries.
Yeah. Well, you're right to point out that there are experts at the war colleges. And just as an example, the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania did a study saying what would happen if we tried to occupy Iraq, and they predicted in great detail the insurgency that would come about. The State Department, with all of its Foreign Service expertise, also did a multi-volume study before we went in saying what would happen. It's not that the government doesn't have experts. It's that the White House wasn't listening to them. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
In your opinion, how important is the process of democratization in the Middle East vital to the fight against international terrorism? And as a follow-up, what changes besides our dependence on international oil resources would you recommend making in foreign policy to further that fight?
I think democratization has gotten a bad name because the United States started talking about democratization after it invaded Iraq. And in many people's minds in the Middle East, the two have been linked. That's quite serious. That if you stand up, in Egypt today and say, well, let's talk about democracy, people are going to say, oh, you're an American stooge. I think it's unfortunate that that's happened, but it has happened. And while we want democracy for every country in the world, and we believe democracy can work in every country in the world, they have to come at it at their own pace and with regard to their own traditions and history. Sometimes if you push democracy too early or in the wrong way, you won't like the results. In Algeria several years ago, they held a democratic election that essentially elected Al-Qaeda. I mean, it's a local branch of Al-Qaeda, but it was Al-Qaeda. And the military stepped in and voided the election. And frankly, the United States appreciated that. Some people, like Robert Baer, who's written a series of books on the Middle East, say, and not just in jest, that if we held an election in Saudi Arabia today, bin Laden would win. We did hold an election in the northwestern provinces of Pakistan last year, and Al-Qaeda is outlawed in Pakistan, so Al-Qaeda didn't win, but the people who won look a lot like Al-Qaeda. So democracy, yes, eventually in some places, sooner in others, but it has to bubble up from the people. It can't be inserted at the point of a bayonet. Yes, sir. I'm afraid this is going to be the last question because I do want to sign some books before I get on the plane
Your
to
nonfiction
Berlin.
is
I'm sorry.
excellent. I can't wait to get your fiction. The one question that puzzles me is that the Bush administration has been extremely successful in one area because it's failed in balancing the budget, it's screwed up this war, it's filed up our tax policy, whatever it is. But they've been very successful in changing the perception of apparently a majority of our fellow citizens as to how you tell fact from fiction. I really mean it. And Karl Rove, our only hope is he goes to prison, but he has he has been able really to get to the dark side of so many people and get them to vote for this guy, this idiot, that I wonder how when you do your games, future games, and then the extrapolation, how and whether you can extrapolate any of that into the future.
But you're absolutely right. I mean, at one point, 80-something% of the American people in opinion polls, when asked if Iraq had something to do with the 9/11 attacks, over 80% of the American people at one point said yes. Wherever did they get that idea? Could it be that the president and vice president and other senior administration officials kept saying it either explicitly or implicitly? Well, after the 9/11 Commission report said that it was not true, that Iraq had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11, public opinion turned around. But there was still 30-something% of the American people who continued to say, in response to opinion polls, that Iraq had something to do with 9/11. And that intrigued the opinion pollsters as to why people still believed it after it was disproven. And so they asked that group a series of questions. And the vast majority of the people who continued to believe that Iraq had something to do with 9/11 said that their major news source was the Fox News network. So I can understand how if you never hear the alternative, that you might continue to believe things like that. And if you listen to certain radio and television, you'll never hear the truth about things that embarrass the administration. I think it's very important in days like these that we seek out media sources like the BBC and The Economist, like NPR, and places where you know you're getting the straight story. Thank you very much for coming.